I moved across the country for love, and he dumped me after 2 weeks. Life felt like one big rom-com montage, packing boxes, tearful goodbyes, and a playlist of upbeat road trip songs blasting through the car speakers. All those cliches became real while driving across the country to start over in Chicago. Eliot had entered the picture through a dating app. Nothing unusual there, but from the first FaceTime, something clicked. He was warm, funny, and had a crinkly-eyed smile that felt like safety wrapped in charm. Late-night calls turned into weekend visits, care packages crossed state lines, and after 3 months, the suggestion came, move here. Let's start a life together. The decision felt bold but right. A job was resigned from, a lease was broken, and every important belonging was packed into a hatchback. Eliot even secured a cozy downtown apartment, our place, he called it. The first week in Chicago felt like a dream. Coffee shop dates, long walks through Millennium Park, and slow evenings wrapped up on the couch. There was laughter over burnt attempts at homemade pasta, and lazy Sunday mornings with sunlight spilling across tangled blankets. Eliot made everything feel easy. The apartment felt like home almost immediately, decorated with mismatched throw pillows and second-hand furniture that somehow worked together. The city itself buzzed with promise, every corner offering something new to discover, another chapter to add to their shared story. There were moments of adjustment, of course. Eliot had an early start at his tech job, while unpacking and job hunting filled her days. Sometimes, the loneliness crept in, a quiet hum in the middle of the afternoon when the apartment was empty and job applications sat unanswered. But then Eliot would come home. His smile, his energy, his casual, "What should we do for dinner?" erased those lonely hours in seconds. It was still early days, but it felt solid, like something worth building on. The city sparkled with endless possibilities, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly as it should. Moving in with Eliot felt like stepping into someone else's life, one that was shinier, more put together. His apartment had big windows that overlooked a little park, a kitchen with mismatched mugs, and plants he somehow managed to keep alive. First, every day felt like a sleepover. We'd wake up tangled in blankets, and he'd grin at me while brushing his teeth, foam covering his smile. He had this way of making even mundane routines feel special, pouring my coffee first, leaving sticky notes on the fridge with dumb jokes, or playing music while he cooked. But life doesn't stay in a honeymoon phase forever. While Eliot went off to work every morning, I stayed behind with my laptop, a too-quiet apartment, and a growing sense of unease. The job hunt wasn't going well. I'd sit at the dining table for hours, sending out resumes, refreshing my inbox until my eyes hurt. Interviews would trickle in now and then, but none of them led anywhere. I told myself it was temporary. Something would come along. Eliot was supportive, at least at first. He'd kiss my forehead and say, "You'll find something soon. You're too smart not to." But eventually, his reassurances grew less frequent, and the unspoken weight of me not contributing financially started to settle between us. Money became a quiet ghost in the apartment. I started buying cheaper groceries, skipping out on things I used to enjoy, a manicure here, a new sweater there. I'd make myself small, as if taking up less space would somehow balance things out. IT wasn't just the money, though. It was the isolation. I had friends back home, a job that kept me busy, family close enough to drop by on Sundays. Now, my world was this apartment, Eliot's schedule, and whatever job postings were still open. Some days, I'd take long walks around the neighborhood just to be around people. I'd sit on a park bench, watching dogs chase after sticks, couples laughing over coffee, joggers with headphones in their ears. It was like I was watching life through glass, separated from it by something invisible but impenetrable. I started dreading the hours before Eliot came home. Not because I didn't love seeing him, I did, but because every evening felt like a tiny performance. Smiling, asking about his day, pretending my own had been productive. Sometimes I'd catch him zoning out when I spoke, nodding absently before glancing at his phone. One Friday night, he suggested we go out for drinks with his coworkers. It was the first time I'd been around people other than Eliot in weeks, and I clung to the opportunity like a lifeline. The bar. Everyone seemed so confident, so sure of themselves. His coworkers talked about quarterly goals and new tech trends while I stirred my cocktail, trying to seem interested. Eliot had his arms slung casually around my shoulders, but I felt miles away from him. When we got home, I asked him if he was happy, if we were happy. He hesitated just a second too long before saying yes. That night, I stared at the ceiling long after Eliot had fallen asleep beside me. For the first time since moving here, a little voice in the back of my mind whispered a question I couldn't ignore. What if this doesn't work out? The night it all fell apart started out ordinary. Eliot was running late again, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-eaten bowl of pasta in front of me. The hum of the fridge filled the silence. I'd stopped asking what time he'd be home, or if he wanted me to wait for dinner. When he finally walked in, nearly 2 hours later, he barely looked at me. He dropped his bag, mumbled something about work, and disappeared into the bedroom. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway, the faint sound of Eliot's phone vibrating somewhere in his bag. Something felt off. It wasn't just the late nights or the distance between us. It was the way he didn't look at me anymore, the way his voice lost its warmth when he said my name. I followed him into the bedroom. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone. His shoes were still on. Eliot, I said softly. He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten I was even there. Are we okay? I asked. His face went still for a moment, then he sighed and set his phone down on the nightstand. Grace, He rubbed his face with both hands, his shoulders slumping forward. I don't think this is working. The air left my lungs. I felt frozen in place, like the ground had just disappeared beneath me. What do you mean? My voice cracked on the last word. Eliot wouldn't meet my eyes. This isn't what I thought it would be. I don't know. I thought it would feel different. I thought we would feel different. The words felt sharp and heavy, like stones dropping into water. I left everything for this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For you. I know, he said quickly, his face twisting with guilt. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Grace. But I don't think I can do this anymore. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of traffic filtered in from the street below, and the faint glow of Eliot's phone lit up the nightstand again. Is there someone else? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He hesitated, just long enough for me to know. No, he said finally. But the way he said it, soft, almost apologetic, told me everything I needed to know. I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded, turned around, and walked out of the bedroom. That night, I slept on the couch. Well, not slept, more like stared at the ceiling until dawn crept in through the living room windows. By morning, Eliot had left for work without saying goodbye. I spent the day packing. I didn't have much, just a few suitcases, some books, and clothes. The apartment felt like it wasn't mine anymore. When Eliot came home that evening, the sight of my bags piled by the door stopped him in his tracks. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly. I looked at him, really looked at him. The man I had uprooted my life for. The man I had built so many dreams around. And for the first time in weeks, I realized I couldn't recognize him anymore. I think you are, I said softly. I grabbed my bags, walked out the door, and didn't look back. The cab ride away from Eliot's apartment felt like floating through static. Streetlights blurred into glowing streaks as I clutched my suitcases, knuckles white around the handles. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there. I ended up in a motel on the edge of downtown. The kind with flickering neon signs and curtains that didn't quite close all the way. The receptionist barely looked up as I slid my credit card across the counter, and the key they handed me was cold and heavy in my palm. The room smelled like bleach and stale smoke. A floral bedspread covered a mattress that sagged in the middle. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my suitcases until the sun rose. When I finally fell asleep, it was daylight, and car horns outside blared in sharp intervals. The next few days blurred together. I spent hours scrolling through job boards on my laptop, sending applications into digital voids. My savings account was draining fast. Chicago was expensive, even in a rundown motel. I avoided looking at my phone. There were no missed calls from Eliot, no apologetic texts asking me to come back. He had let me go without a fight, and somehow, that hurt more than anything he could have said. On the 5th day, my laptop pinged with an email. An interview request for an admin position at a marketing agency. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. The interview was scheduled for 2 days later. I dug through my suitcase for something professional, found a wrinkled blouse and slacks I hadn't worn since my last job. I ironed them on the motel room's tiny ironing board, balancing it on uneven carpet. That morning, I stood in front of the motel mirror and stared at myself. Puffy eyes, dark circles, lips chewed raw from nervous habit. I pulled my hair back, put on lipstick, and practiced my smile. The office building was sleek and modern, filled with people who looked like they belonged there. I felt like an intruder, clutching my resume and trying to steady my breathing. The interviewer, a woman named Hannah, was kind. She asked about my previous experience, about my move to Chicago. I didn't mention Eliot. I didn't mention the motel. Well, Grace, Hannah said at the end of the interview, you seem like someone who can handle herself under pressure. We'll be in touch soon. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough to keep me going. That night, I walked to a diner a few blocks from the motel. It had a cracked vinyl booth by the window and a waitress named Carla who called everyone honey. I ordered pancakes and coffee, even though it was 9 p.m. As I sat there, eating syrup-soaked pancakes in the glow of fluorescent lights, something shifted. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was stillness. A fragile, tentative sort of calm. For the first time since Eliot said, I don't think this is working, the city didn't feel like it was swallowing me whole. IT wasn't much, but it was a start. The email came 3 days later. We'd like to offer you the position. I stared at the screen for a long time, the tiny text swimming in my vision. Then I exhaled, a sharp, shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The admin job wasn't glamorous, and the salary wasn't impressive, but it meant stability. It meant no more watching my savings drain away in a dingy motel room. I started the following Monday. The office was bright and open, filled with people clicking away at keyboards and exchanging casual banter over the hum of the coffee machine. My desk sat near the window, overlooking a sliver of Lake Michigan in the distance. The first few weeks passed in a blur of onboarding documents, training sessions, and nervous introductions. People were kind, but distant, cordial in that polite office way. No one asked too many questions, which was both a relief and a reminder of how invisible I felt in this new city. After my first paycheck, I found a small studio apartment on the edge of Logan Square. It was old and smelled faintly of paint, but it was mine. I spent an entire weekend scrubbing the floors, hanging cheap curtains, and arranging my few belongings into something that resembled a home. I bought a potted plant from a corner store. A little fern named Henry. I wasn't sure if I'd keep it alive, but it felt good to have something to care for again. Work kept me busy, and routines began to form. Mornings with strong coffee and toast by the window, evenings curled up on a thrift store love seat with a book or some mediocre streaming show playing in the background. One Friday after work, I lingered near the break room, clutching a mug of tea as a few coworkers debated dinner plans. They invited me along, probably out of politeness, and I surprised myself by saying yes. The restaurant was loud and crowded, but the food was good and the drinks flowed easily. There was laughter, light teasing, and at some point, someone asked how I ended up in Chicago. I hesitated, swirling my drink, before settling on a half-truth. Needed a change. Wanted something new. They nodded, satisfied, and the conversation moved on. That night, walking home under streetlights that painted the sidewalk gold, I felt lighter. It wasn't happiness, exactly. But it wasn't sadness, either. Over the next few months, life slowly rebuilt itself. I found a yoga class on Sunday mornings, a favorite cafe where the barista remembered my name, and a bookstore that hosted poetry readings on Thursdays. Sometimes, when the train rattled past skyscrapers or the sun set pink over the lake, I'd think about Eliot. Not with anger, not even with sadness, really. Just with a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what couldn't be. One evening, while sorting through my emails, I noticed a message buried in my inbox. The subject line read, "Hey, I hope you're okay." It was from Eliot. For a long time, I just stared at it. My finger hovered over the mouse, but I couldn't bring myself to click. Instead, I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on the floor of my tiny apartment. Henry the fern sat on the windowsill, his leaves catching the last light of the day. I raised my glass slightly, as if in a toast, to him, to me, to everything that came before and whatever came next. IT wasn't much, but it was starting to feel like enough. Winter crept into Chicago quietly, then all at once. The first snow arrived on a Tuesday morning, dusting the sidewalks and rooftops in pale glitter. From my window, the city looked softer, almost gentle. AT work, the office buzzed with holiday plans and end-of-year deadlines. Someone brought in homemade cookies. Another person strung up twinkling lights around the break room door. For the first time since I arrived in Chicago, I felt like I belonged to something small, but real. I'd started talking more to a coworker named Natalie. She worked in the creative department and had a loud laugh that carried across the office. One afternoon, she dropped a candy cane on my desk and said, "You're coming to our holiday party on Friday." No arguments. I went. The party was held in some overpriced rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place where the drinks come with tiny flowers and the heaters never quite reach your ankles. But it was fun. Natalie dragged me onto the dance floor, and we laughed as a coworker in finance attempted the worm. Later, as the crowd thinned and the music faded into something slower, Natalie and I ended up leaning against the railing, looking out over the glittering skyline. "So, are you staying in Chicago long-term?" she asked, her breath fogging in the cold air. I thought about it. About my tiny apartment, the fern on the windowsill, the growing sense of routine in my life. "I think so," I said. She grinned. "Good. You're stuck with me now." By January, things felt settled. Not perfect, not even entirely steady, but settled enough. I'd saved up enough money to replace the threadbare love seat in my apartment. I bought a new coat, one that actually kept me warm, and then something unexpected happened. I was at the bookstore cafe one Sunday, sipping tea and flipping through a poetry anthology, when someone asked, "Mind if I sit here?" He had a book tucked under his arm and a coffee in his hand. His name was Alex. We talked about books and winter weather, about how neither of us could ever leave a bookstore without buying something. He had kind eyes and a slightly crooked smile, and when he asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime, I surprised myself by saying yes. Dinner turned into drinks, which turned into long walks along icy sidewalks, which turned into him kissing me goodnight under my apartment's flickering porch light. It wasn't a grand romance. Not yet. It was tentative, cautious, two people figuring out if their broken edges could fit together, but it felt good. One evening, Alex asked, "Do you ever regret moving here?" I looked out the window of the diner we were sitting in, watching snowflakes catch in the streetlights. "No," I said softly. "Not anymore." Because despite everything, the heartbreak, the empty savings account, the nights spent in a cold motel room, Chicago had become mine. Not Eliot's. Not anyone else's. Just mine. I walked home that night, Alex's gloved hand wrapped around mine, and felt something warm flicker in my chest. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was something like happiness. Spring arrived in Chicago in slow, hesitant steps. Patches of green began to creep across the frozen parks, and the city seemed to exhale after months of holding its breath. The sun stayed out a little longer each day, casting golden light across my studio apartment in the evenings. I was different now. Not fully healed, not yet, but stitched back together in a way that felt sturdy. Alex and I were still seeing each other. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or some grand love story. It was something quieter, steadier. He'd leave a note on my counter when he stopped by, something simple like, "Don't forget to water Henry," smiley face, or "Dinner Friday." My treat. At work, things were better, too. Hannah, my manager, started giving me more responsibilities. I felt useful there, needed. Natalie and I became closer friends, our desks often cluttered with shared snacks and inside jokes scribbled on sticky notes. One Thursday afternoon, an email arrived in my inbox. The subject line read, "Closure." It was from Eliot. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting in knots. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately. Another part, the part that still occasionally wondered why, needed to know. The message was short. He wrote about regret, about how he hoped I was doing well, about how he thought of me often. There was no grand apology, no attempt to ask for anything back. Just words floating in digital space, final, weightless, and strangely unimportant. I closed the email without replying. That night, Alex and I went out for dinner. It wasn't anything special, just burgers at a corner diner. But halfway through our meal, Alex said, "You seem lighter lately." "Happier." I smiled and realized he was right. After dinner, we walked along the lakefront. The city lights shimmered on the water, and the air smelled faintly of rain. For a moment, I stopped and looked out at the skyline, The same skyline I'd stared at from Eliot's apartment all those months ago, but now it felt different. It felt mine. Chicago wasn't the place where I had been left behind anymore. It was the place where I'd started over. Where I'd stumbled, fallen, and slowly, painstakingly, learned how to stand again. As Alex's hand found mine, I squeezed it gently. We kept walking, the sound of waves lapping against the shore blending with the distant hum of traffic. There was no perfect ending, no grand moment of revelation. Just this, a city, a night, a fragile but steady sense of peace, and maybe that was enough.